Light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome, I am Sister Who. For many years, I suppose, I've been asked, how did this all begin? And I am not going to even attempt to tell all that within this episode, but it's on quite a number of different things, but the reason I mention that, I guess, is because what's on my mind at the moment is one of my favorite quotes from Albert Einstein, that I attempted to live a normal life but found it was quite impossible for me. A lot of people say that normal is just a setting on the washing machine. And to a certain point, I agree. I understand a certain predisposition, I guess, or it's an easy, well, like Thoreau said, as far as life at Walden Pond, that he found from going back and forth to get water from the pond each day, that in no time at all there were ruts that were starting to be worn into the grass. Thinking of anything familiar, anything that happens repetitively as normal, is a very easy sort of practice to fall into. Being attentive to what is actually true in one's life and in the world around oneself, I would say, is the first step away from that becoming the established rut that then discourages you from seeing anything outside of that. I mean, in a sense, what the most damaging possibility of normal is that it blinds you to everything that is not within its scope. That when this is defined as normal, everything outside of that, it's almost as if it doesn't exist anymore, or if it's somehow devalued or trivialized. When asked, where would we be if it were not for autistic people, Temple Grandin's response is generally that we'd still be back living in the caves with the Neanderthals and the Cro-Magnon civilizations, because she is another person who insists that a lot of the humanity's major breakthroughs have come through autistic people. The point I'm wanting to deal with now, though, is this challenge of what constitutes a normal life and living a normal life, and how being normal and living a normal life becomes impossible. That when I arrived at kindergarten, even, or even before kindergarten, the normal was to get up in the morning, get on the school bus, and go to school. Well, the first 2 days, because I didn't have a good sense of time, and it was a totally unfamiliar experience and everything, the first 2 days of kindergarten, I missed the bus. And it was on the third day that my parents were out there to provide added guidance to be sure that I did get on the bus the third day. That only lasted till about third grade, however, because there was so much bullying and hostility on the school bus getting from where my parents lived to where the school was, that by third grade I was just old enough and finally learned to ride a bicycle, which I learned rather late, actually. They kept trying to teach me how to ride a bicycle, and I would always lose my balance and fall off and crash, and it just was not working. And finally, I think it was after kindergarten. I think it may have been somewhere between first and second grade, maybe even between second and third grade. But once I learned, it was not a problem, and I guess I was mature enough, and my parents didn't know what else to do with me, so whatever I asked for, well, correction. It wasn't that I got whatever I asked for, it was that when I asked for something that didn't cost anything, and they couldn't think of a good reason for preventing it, they would allow it. So in third grade, when I asked that I be allowed to ride my bicycle to school so that I could avoid all the bullies on the school bus, it didn't occur to my parents to say no. And then they essentially never monitored the situation or made sure that I was okay or anything. It was a very neglectful, hands-off kind of parenting style, I guess. But the basic point being that we lived in southern Wisconsin, and winters are long and cold, and sometimes there was 15 inches of snow on the ground. And I rode my bicycle to school even through a foot of snow, and I'm not making that up, I really did. Because bundling up in 3 layers of clothes and pedaling a bicycle 3 miles to get to school was preferable to trying to deal with the bullies on the school bus, which on one hand, society has this norm of how it's supposed to be, but society doesn't really pay attention to all the times when it doesn't happen. The supposed to was that I was going to get on the school bus, which was going to be pleasant, was going to take me to school, which was going to be pleasant. I would get back on the bus and come home again, and everything would be pleasant all the way around. Well, the norm in my experience was that the school bus was the domain of bullies, because the elderly school bus driver was not going to do anything as long as there was no bloodshed, which thankfully nothing ever quite got to that point, but there were a couple times where I think it came very close. But the norm of my experience was not the norm that everybody said there should be. And the question becomes, how hard did I try, I guess. I attempted to live a normal life. Well, I did make an attempt, but when it didn't work, I immediately looked for something better to do instead. It didn't take me 23 tries or whatever. It didn't take me that long to figure out this is not working. Something else needs to happen. And so I found riding my bicycle to school, no matter how cold, no matter what the weather, no matter what it was, I was going to, come hell or high water, I was going to ride that bicycle to school and satisfy my obligations that way, so that I did not have to deal with the bullies on the school bus. And then going up through high school, junior high, and in junior high, well, by the time I got to junior high, I was pretty much treated like an invisible person, because nobody really knew what to do with me. But I showed up, I turned in my homework, consequently I got good grades and made my way through the system. In high school it was very similar. I was pretty much invisible, but I made my way through the system and got the right pieces of paper signed, but it was never really normal, because I had this experience of riding my bicycle to school in all weather, and even for the first 2 years of high school, in January there would be one bicycle stuck in a snowbank out by the bike rack, and it was mine. I would, because the janitors or basically no one ever cleared the snow away, because no one expected anyone to be riding a bicycle, I didn't worry about putting my bicycle in the rack. I just would ride it up onto the sidewalk and lift it up and jam it into the snowbank, and there it would stand till the end of the day, when I would pull it out of the snowbank and ride it home again. And you know, and so my high school, throughout my high school years, there was one bicycle by the rack all winter long during the days, and it was mine. That's, I think it's safe to say that's not normal. And then to know from the time that you're 4, from the time I was 4, I knew that I was fundamentally different in some way, but I couldn't figure out what it was. It wasn't until I was 26 going on 27 that I finally figured out I was gay, and everything began to make sense. But up until that point, it was as if there was a ghost following me around, and I couldn't tell what it was or how to make sense of it. But that too was an experience that, as far as I know, nobody else in my high school had. I guess because of believing in life, believing even in my own life when nobody else seemed to, I became a very self-initiated, self-starter kind of person very early on, always being the one to stand up and do something rather than wait for someone to tell me to do it, and thinking about things deeply and what things mean and why are we doing this? And if nobody would answer my question, then I would find my own answer to the question. But I was not going to live with questions being unanswered. That may be normal for everyone else, but it was not acceptable to me. And so I didn't know what gay was when I found out. I mean, it was all these different things that made it impossible for me to have a normal life. And I suppose, how possible would it have been for me to simply not do any of those things? I think if I had not done any of those things, I wouldn't have had sufficient value or found sufficient reason for any of my struggles. It would have been so empty, and I was too alive to ever do that. But because I was a self-starter, willing to do things that other people, you know, if I wanted to find out, I found a way to investigate. When I wanted to go visit a friend in another city when I was about 14, I got up one morning. I don't remember if it was a Wednesday or a Saturday. I think it was one of the two, though. And I didn't have a car. I didn't have a driver's license. It was summertime. I had nowhere else I had to be. So I called him up on the telephone, said, I'm coming to visit. I'll be there this evening. And I told my parents, I'm riding my bicycle to go visit Wes, and he lives in Sterling, Illinois. And they just said, okay. Didn't say anything, and said, I'll call you when I get there. And I started pedaling. It was 60 miles. And then I got there and spent the night there, and the next day I got up and said, well, why don't I go visit so-and-so over in that other little town? And so I rode off that direction and visited them for a couple days. And on the 4th day, I decided, well, not much else to do, so I'll go home. So then I rode from there back to my parents' house again. And you know, there was sufficient phone communication during that time that no one really worried, as far as I know. But then when I got back, it kind of surprised me when I went to a youth group meeting and someone was remarking on this 140-mile bike trip that I'd just done as if it was some incredible thing. And I couldn't quite figure out what was so special about it, because to me it was little more than you sit on a bike, you pedal, and after a certain amount of time you find yourself in a different place. And you just go, you know, whatever the road is right in front of you, you go over the next hill and over the next hill and over the next hill. And I really didn't think about the whole stretch of what the whole trip included. I wasn't thinking about pedaling 140 miles. That was an incomprehensible number. And I really wasn't even thinking about pedaling 60 miles because I couldn't understand that either. but I could understand pedaling for 2 or 3 more miles, and then another 2 or 3 more miles, and another 2 or 3 more miles. And by being willing to do something that was different at all, I found myself moving in a direction that apparently no one else had ever moved, or at least no one else that I knew. Certainly not by bicycle along that path. The other thing that wove in between all of that, though, in junior high and high school especially, was the school guidance counselor always nagging, not exactly nagging, but frequent reminders of what are you going to do with your life? What do you want to be when you grow up? And I had no idea, and in retrospect, I would say, how does anybody know how does anyone have any idea? You have an aspiration, perhaps, a plan, but so much of it depends on how things turn out and on what opportunities are provided. Somebody was telling me once about Oprah Winfrey and her affection for Stedman, this man who was going around doing lectures saying, have a plan and work your plan. And Oprah would respond, or don't, I didn't. Oprah wound up being incredibly successful because of the relationships around her and because of opportunities and events that fell into place. Did she plan for all of that to happen? You know, that's exactly what she meant to happen? No, she had no idea. And she's been very upfront about that. And as Sister Who, I also had no idea that, and yet after 27 years now of being Sister Who, 27 years and counting, I really think this is what I was born to do. And here I am, you know, as time passes, I keep getting older, but I can't imagine ever getting old because I'm a little bit too full of life, I guess. And looking at the numbers on my birthdays, and they don't make any sense to me because I don't feel that old. I don't think of myself as that old. And where is this whole phase where you're supposed to have a career that I heard so much about from the school guidance counselor in junior high and high school? You know, that what are you going to do for a career? What's going to be your vocation? What's going to be your working life? And being Sister Who, at least at this point, is still not a financially self-supporting work. Perhaps in the near future it will be, but for the moment it's not. And so I just have to take inventory of the resources I have available, the opportunities that I have available, and figure out what is the most I can do with those. And yet, to be Sister Who for 27 years at this point, I guess it's kind of the equivalent of a career, but doesn't satisfy a lot of the descriptions people assign to careers. You know, that this is my career, this is my life, but it's not a financially self-supporting work or career or life. And so does that mean it's less so, or does that simply mean that I will be remembered a little differently? Bridging from that a bit, what this kind of leads into that I was pondering the other day, is to what extent being a person with a disability is synonymous with being a perpetual victim. That there, you know, and to some extent there will always be people who look at me and see, you know, oh, you have autism, oh, you poor thing. Like something terrible happened to you by having autism. And, well, it's like every other kind of life you can name. It's a mix of positives and negatives. On one hand, I have frequent nightmares. On the other hand, I have an intellect way above average and have done a lot of creative things and noticed details that other people miss. And there are a lot of ways that having autism is an advantage for dealing with a complex and overfilled, overstuffed kind of world. To be able to notice the details is sometimes helpful because in certain situations it allows me to orchestrate the details more cohesively and comprehensively and more productively. But if you don't even know the details are there, then you don't quite understand why something is happening. kind of like before we had Geiger counters and discovered radiation, people were still getting sick from being too close to uranium and so forth, but they didn't know why. In a lot of cultures and civilizations of times past, it seems that whatever was unexplainable was written off as some kind of witchcraft. But it's just because they couldn't explain it. And by that, what they were referring to was not the nature-oriented religion associated with Wicca, which practitioners are also called witches, but it was something different. It was, witchcraft was basically the idea that there was some person with malevolent intentions who knew how to manipulate forces and energies and circumstances and outcomes in ways that would be personally advantageous, maybe, but especially that would be injurious to others. And so it was viewed with suspicion, and someone who was accused of witchcraft by whatever translated word, because witchcraft is the English word, but I mean, that person would be essentially identified as an enemy of the whole tribe. And in many cases, I suppose, well, I suppose especially during the Spanish Inquisition, what neo-pagans call the burning times, that there were witches burned at the stake because of their disagreement with Christianity, and perhaps for a variety of other reasons. There's a lot of speculation around it. But the curious thing about that, and the way that for those who believe in karma, to me it sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. So I keep getting shoved back to this word sometimes, because every idea I've ever encountered, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It's like one of the frustrations of being human is being consigned to a world where everything is measured by sometimes. And during the burning times, you know, the way that karma kind of played out, I guess you could say, is that all sorts of women, and I think some men too, were burned as witches because of disagreements with the religious state that ruled everything at the time. Along with them, they would burn their black cats, whom are sometimes described as the familiar, the companion animal of a person dealing with sorcery and witchcraft and so forth. Which a lot of what the witches were practicing was really just herbalism, and it really wasn't anything to do with supernatural magical powers or what have you. But the point being that when they killed the witches, and they killed the witches' familiars, all the cats, the rat population exploded, because the cats weren't keeping the rats in check anymore. And as the rat population exploded, the fleas spread like crazy and carried with them the Black Plague, and Europe was decimated by the Black Plague. And I have to wonder, if they hadn't killed any of the cats, would any of that have happened? But the Black Plague was so, the bubonic plague was so devastating that it literally rewrote the history of Europe in many locations. And to some extent rewrote the history of medicine and science as well. But in the midst of all this, anyone who wanted to try to pursue what is a normal life, I'm not sure a normal life has really been that available to anyone unless they're willing to compromise who and what they are, and who, you know, their very basic integrity, and living within some prescribed notion that has nothing to do with truth or individuality. And what makes that all the more peculiar to me is that it was so mandated by religious people, that this conformity and this homogeneity and this package of expectations was mandated by people who claim to worship a divine being who has demonstrated such phenomenal diversity and such unending fluctuation throughout all of the biblical records, throughout the world all around us. It's as if the whole pursuit of normal is absolutely contrary to the heart of Christianity and to every other spiritual system. That the practices that are prescribed are because somebody is trying to replicate spiritual experience that some particular mystic has had. But the problem with any mystic experience is that you cannot have someone else's experience. You can only have your own. And as logical, as common as it may be to assume that if I can have the experience, everyone can, my experience can be normative, I would say, well, no, it really can't, because there's too many differences between one individual and another. And in understanding it's not normative, that I've had an experience, somebody else is going to have his or her experience, but none of this is normative. It's just a whole lot of individual memories that happen. Sometimes they have things in common with others, and sometimes they don't. But as the individual experiences happen, it takes each of us further and further away from normal if we're honest with ourselves about it. And ultimately what we wind up with is living our own life and trying to make sense of it, assigning meaning in ways and where we can in order to empower understanding to go even further. I think I was born to be Sister Who. There has not been anything normal about it. But I think to have a normal life, I would have had to sacrifice my integrity and everything that I innately am, and I would have had to stand in opposition to the truth of myself and of my life. And I cannot see any God or any divine incarnation of God that would refer to himself as being the way, the truth, and the life. As, you know, if Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, for me that truth includes being gay and being autistic. And what I have to make sense of is how those things can be genuinely good. Thank you very much for watching.